This video is sponsored by Skillshare. How to make a professional tongue for your puppet.
To the puppet nerds of the world, this may sound absurd, but this is the place you need to be. We'll do an interview and then we'll stitch and glue all of the dolls, we'll make it shake. If you wanna be in the know and to play like a pro, subscribe to Creutinger Puppets.
Welcome back, Adam Creutinger here, and today we're going to be talking about puppet tongues. Now there's an endless amount of different techniques you could use to make a tongue for your puppet, and you're definitely not limited to these choices. Not to mention all these could be different by just changing the materials and colors alone. But here's 4 of my favorite techniques for creating a tongue for your puppet. To keep it simple for today, we're going to work with pretty much the same shape, kind of that traditional heart shape for your puppet's tongue. But again, keep in mind the tongue that you make could be any shape at all. Even think if it's a tongue for a lizard or a snake or even a dragon, or really anything. I'm going to walk you through how to make a tongue out of felt, ultra suede, L200, and even upholstery foam. But this project was inspired by a comment that I had on the channel. Years ago, me, Cameron, and some friends made a commercial for a local business. You can click right here to see that ad on my channel. You'll recognize a lot of the puppets from that shoot. It was for a dental company and we did some cool effects in it. And one of the effects, I had to make a giant tongue that uses one of these techniques. Make sure to stick around till the end so you can see that whole process and even a behind the scenes look. All right, let's get started. The first tongue I'm going to show you how to make is just using felt. This is probably the most go-to choice because it's the most available material you can find locally. Now, a common theme you'll find to making many of these tongues is to simply fold it in half and cut out a heart shape like this. And then you get a nice tongue. Now, to add more details to this tongue, one of my favorite things to use is just Sharpie markers. The nice thing about Sharpies is they come in so many colors. I recommend getting a rainbow pack like this. They're really handy in a lot of different parts of building a puppet. I have some more videos coming out soon using those techniques. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss them. But for the tongue, here's how I use it. What I'm going to do is pick out a color that's going to show up really well on this pink. Today, I think I'm going to use this purple here. And what I'm going to do is add some details just like this. Put a little slit in the middle of the tongue, and then it kind of adds some shading around it like this. I like to start with a darker color and then get a little lighter. Let me do some blending with this too. Depending on the design of your character, there might be different colors that you want to use. I went a little darker on the purple with this one because I wanted to kind of match the eyelids of this character. You might recognize this puppet head from the eye blink mechanism video. Make sure to click here if you want to check that out too. Now let's see how this looks. That looks pretty good. Now you can use pretty much any glue you want to attach the tongue to the puppet. You could use contact cement or hot glue, but my favorite is Fabri-Tac. I use an off-brand called 3-in-1. Now right now I'm not going to glue the tongue into the mouth because I want to show you a couple different techniques first. Now that we finished the felt example, let's go on to the ultra suede. Ultra suede is the industry standard for puppet tongues that are going to be flat. Let's use some to make a little tongue. Now just like before, I'm going to fold this in half and cut out a heart shape. Now if you want, you could make a pattern for your tongue, but most of the time I just kind of YOLO it like this. And there you have a really nice tongue. One of the nice things about the ultra suede over the felt is that the ultra suede is going to last a lot longer, and little fuzzes that come off of it. That's not going to happen with this. Now let me do some little designs on this one too. Again, I'm just using a Sharpie to add these details. You can do as much or as little as you want. You can go back and forth with the dark and light colors to kind of blend them together. Now that is a good looking tongue. And you can attach it the exact same way. Now let's see how this one looks in the puppet. All right, let's see here. That also looks really nice. Now that I've shown you a couple different versions of how to make a flat version of a tongue, next I'm going to show you some more 3D styles. And for the next one, we're going to use a soft foam called L200. It also goes by the name EVA foam or EVA. This is a great choice if you want your tongue to have a little bit more dimension to it. But it doesn't work with all puppet designs. I tend to use it more so on a bigger puppet or a puppet that has a lip, because with a tongue like this, the puppet's mouth won't be able to close all the way because you're kind of putting a little bumper in the mouth. Let's take a look. For this foam, I am going to make a little pattern, but I'm going to make the pattern the same way I made the other tongues, just by folding this in half and cutting out the shape that I want. Folding it in half makes this perfectly symmetrical. Now that I have a pattern, I'm going to trace it and cut it out. To cut this out, I use a razor blade or a pair of scissors. Today I'm going to use the scissors. Now the immediate problem you'll notice with this is that the foam is a block. First thing we want to do is round out these top edges, but you don't round out the bottom half. You want this to be flat, and we only want that rounded shape on the top of the tongue. First thing I'm going to do is just cut away this edge with the scissors. So if you remember this detail on the tongue, we're trying to create a sense of depth with this color that we're creating. In the 3D version, we actually want to create a little bit of a valley in there. So here's how I do it. I kind of fold this in half like this, and I'll take my scissors and I'll kind of gently just cut away at the very tip of it. That creates a little bit of that valley in there. So with the scissors, we've done all of our rough shaping and taken out a lot of those big corners. The next thing I'm going to do is use a rough piece of sandpaper to really start shaping it. I like to use a 60 or 80 grit sandpaper for this. So I'm going to start shaping. I make a point to kind of pull down toward the base of the tongue because I don't want this bottom edge to be rounded. Now if we look at this from the side, you can see it's really starting to curve up and then curve down. However, I also want this tongue to be like a little bit of a slide. So I'm going to sand this front part of the tongue down a little bit lower. There we go, it's almost done now. Now to get this ridge in the middle a little bit more defined, again, I like to kind of fold this in half and then very lightly sand it right on that folded piece. That's starting to look really nice. Now after I'm done with that sandpaper, I move on to a finer grit. This one's about 150, but you can get a little bit finer if you want. Now I'm just going to sand over the whole thing, making it even more smooth. Now that looks pretty good. Next, I want to add some color to this. Trying to color this whole thing with Sharpie would be kind of tedious and wasteful. I like to just use a little bit of acrylic paint. Now one thing's going to seem a little bit unusual with my painting technique for this. I don't use a paintbrush or a spray paint. I actually use my fingers. Now the reason for this is because foam is kind of like a sponge. Actually, a sponge literally is foam. And sponges and foam are very absorbent. If I was to use spray paint or a paintbrush, that pigment would just sit on top of the foam. I really want to push it deep into the foam. That way, if the tongue gets a little bit of a nick or a scratch into the foam, it's not going to show the white. Let me show you how I do that. I'll get a piece of scrap paper here for painting, and I just use a plain cheap acrylic paint. So I'm going to use a little bit of red. And I want the tongue to be a little bit more pink, so I'm going to add a little bit of white too. Let me stir it up. Now once that's stirred up, I just dip my fingers in and start really pushing that paint in. I'm really pinching the foam and really trying to let it absorb all the paint, or at least as much paint as it will take. All right, that looks good. I'm gonna let that sit to dry. All right, there it is, and it is all dry and looking pretty good. Now I'm gonna add a little bit more color just like before. And you can probably already see that because of the dimension of this shaped tongue, you get a nice valley in the middle. And the shadow that creates already makes good definition in the puppet. But we can make it a little bit better by adding some color. And again, I like to use the Sharpies for this. Thing that's really nice about using Sharpies on this type of foam is that I can do blending with some rubbing alcohol. Since these Sharpies are alcohol based, the rubbing alcohol lets me move it around a little bit. First of all, this is not mandatory. This tongue looks fine as it is and will work well. But if you want to do a little bit extra blending, a little bit of rubbing alcohol will help too. I have a tiny bit in the cap here, and all I'm going to do is take a little scrap piece of foam as a little applicator, and I'll just touch the rubbing alcohol. And what I can do is really start to blend this out more. That looks pretty good. Once that's dry, I'm gonna go in with a little bit more darker Sharpie down here too, and really bring it all together. Make sure to let the alcohol dry before doing this. There we go, that's a nice tongue. Now this tongue is done, and you can use it as is if you want, but one more thing I like to do sometimes is to give it a coat of creaturecast. Creaturecast is a neoprene rubber that will keep this a little bit more sturdy. It goes on almost looking like Elmer's glue, but when it dries, it's clear. That'll make this last a lot longer. Now let's see how this tongue looks in this monster. That is pretty nice. To attach this, I would use the same glue, or one of the other ones that I mentioned. Now this last technique is the best technique if you want to make a bigger tongue. It's the same technique that I used to make that jumbo tongue for the mini dental implants commercial. Before we move on, let me tell you about Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creators. You can explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity. And my favorite thing about it is it is curated specifically for learning. That means there's no ads. Plus, they're also always launching new premium classes, so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. A class I took recently was Productivity for Creatives by Thomas Frank. One of the things that he mentioned in the class that resonated with me on productivity was to focus on metrics that are going to push me forward in ways that matter to me, and not the way external pressures try to push me in. This was great advice because as a YouTuber, it's so easy to get caught up in the comments and what other people think you should do. These are things that are just gonna distract you from being creative. So definitely check out that class, but there's a bunch of other great classes too. They have classes in illustration, graphic design, animation, and I even created my own puppet building class too. My class takes you through an entire build from beginning to end, including the pattern making. And if you act now, the first 1,000 of my subscribers that click on the link in my description will get a free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the build. We're gonna make another big tongue right now, but it's not gonna be quite as big. To make this, we're gonna use this soft cushion foam. If your piece is too big, a good way to cut it down is with an electric knife. I've used a lot of these techniques before too. Click right here if you want to see the video on how I made a Bigfoot puppet that was carved using this type of foam. But anyway, let me cut this piece down a little bit. It's too thick right now. There we go, that's much better. Now once you have a hunk of foam the size that you want to use, we have to color it first. Now the best way to color this type of foam is by dyeing it, and I just use a simple RIT dye for that. Let's take a look. This is the RIT dye that I like to use. You can obviously use whatever color you want your tongue to be. Now the more dye you use, the darker it will be. And also the longer you let it sit in the dye bath, the darker it will be. It's also a good idea to use rubber gloves because this dye can take a while to come out of your hands. So if it's your first time dyeing this, I recommend taking a couple little pieces and doing some tests. I like to use a dishwashing tub like this, and I fill it about halfway with hot water. The hottest temperature from your tap water will work fine. So now I just take the piece that I have and I dunk it into the water. While it's underwater, I really press it down. You notice all those air bubbles coming out. You want all the air out of the foam. This allows the dye in the water to get all the way to the middle of the foam. Now if I take it out and give it a squeeze, you can already tell that it's taken in a lot of color. This is where we were before. Now, if I leave this in even longer, it's going to become an even darker red. But to me, for a tongue, I think this is the perfect color. After that, you just squeeze all the dye water out of the foam and then dip it into a bucket of clean water. And then you want to rinse it off and wring it out until no more dye water comes out. And then I squeeze all the water out one more time and let it dry outside. And when you're done, you'll have a piece of foam just like this. Now, yet again, I want to make a pattern for this tongue. So I'm going to use some scrap paper here. I'm going to kind of actually roughly draw it out this time. I want to make sure that it fits inside of the foam. So let me see here. I'm going to go for a really wide tongue like this. I'm just going to fold that in half. And then there we have a perfect tongue. Let me trace it out onto the foam. And I'm going to do the first couple cuts with the electric knife again. And just like with the L200, I'm going to take the edges off the corner. And kind of get that middle valley again too. Now it's really blocked out and I want to take some of these edges off of these corners. So I'm going to go in next with scissors and really try to smooth it out the best I can. Now that's about as smooth as I can get it with scissors. You could go on to smaller scissors, like little cuticle scissors, but I like to move on to sanding it. Now to do the final shaping, I do a lot of sanding. For these first two techniques, if you use them, make sure to use eye protection and a mask so you don't breathe in the particles. The first way is by using a belt sander. I like to use a brand new 150 grit sandpaper on the belt sander. And you have to do this very carefully. Not only do you have to use the eye protection and the mask, but you have to go very slowly. The reason for that is the belt could grab onto the foam and rip it right out of your hands. So you want to go very slowly and pushing very gently. And you want a kind of a firm grip on the foam, but not too tight. You need to be able to let go really quickly in case it gets away from you. I personally don't use this method that much just because of the risk of it getting caught into the machine. Because then I'd have to start my sculpting project completely from scratch. To me, it's just not worth it. Another way is to cut out a disc out of the sandpaper. And then I fix this onto a Dremel tool. Again, make sure to wear eye protection and a mask with this too. Now this technique with the Dremel tool is almost like shaving. You want to come in at a slight angle. You don't want the sandpaper to be completely parallel to the foam, or else it'll grab it and just throw it like this. What you really want to do is have a gentle touch and carefully caress the edges with just the top edge of the sandpaper. Take your time, go slow. And watch out for your hands too. If this is your first time, I highly recommend using some work gloves. And that comes out pretty smooth. I could have done it a little bit more, but I wanted to show you my last technique that I like to use. And this is actually the most common technique that I use for carving this type of foam. And that's just to use regular sandpaper. It does take a lot longer to sculpt this way. However, the benefit is that you don't run the risk of destroying your whole piece with one little misstep. All I do is just very gently sand at it like this. You'll notice I'm only going in one direction. With each stroke, I'm putting it down in motion and then bringing it back. I'm not sanding it back and forth like this. Talk about control. With this, you're going so slow that you really can't possibly make a mistake that easily. And in fact, it goes so slow, at first, you might think it's actually doing nothing. But once you look closely, you'll see little pieces starting to come off. And there we have it, a nice large tongue that's nice and soft. One of the benefits of using one of these tongues is in a bigger puppet. That way you have a really big tongue that has a lot of dimension but not a lot of weight to it. And also it'll compress if you close the mouth of the puppet. And this is the technique that I used to make that jumbo tongue for the mini dental implants commercial. It's the exact same thing but much bigger. And if you're wondering how I operated that, I glued it to a glove. Let's take a look. Here is that tongue. You can tell it's the exact same technique that I used here. We just have a slightly different color dye job. And all I did is I took a gardening glove, I stitched a sleeve onto it so I had a little bit more clearance, and I glued it to the back of this foam. The type of glue I used was Super 74 spray adhesive. This is always the type of glue you want to use when gluing this type of soft upholstery foam. It holds up really well and stays flexible. And one thing I did for this design was I spread the fingers out as far as I could so I could get a lot of manipulation into the tongue. Let me show you. So I'll put my hand in like this, and just by moving my wrist and the hand, I was able to get a lot of really cool tongue movements for the tongue so it could look a bit more realistic. And that whole mouth with the uvula and everything was just a big storage bin flipped upside down with the top cut out of it. To get really cool puppet effects like that, you don't really have to overthink things. Sometimes the most simple technique is the most effective technique. If there's any other interesting effects that you've seen in the puppetry world or even in some of our videos, be sure to let us know if you want to know how it's done. I could make a dedicated video on how it works. Make sure to check out puppetnerd.com for all the latest puppetry news and projects. Anyway, that's it for now. I'll see you next time.